Morning, Lisa.
Morning, Gary.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good, good. Now, I appreciate the time you've given me today to do this for us. And before we discuss safety and lockdowns in the education sector, what I'd like to do, because I think it's worth explaining to the people who's going to be watching this, the vast experience you have in the sector that you're in, and because there's a lot of confusing and conflicting evidence in the education sector about what they have to do within safety, lockdowns, and obviously with Martyn's Law coming up, there's a lot of people that are worried in what they'll have to do. But as I say, with your experience, I think if you can just reassure people what they do, but if you can explain what you've done in the past first.
Yeah, of course I will. My background is, I started in the civil service 20 odd years ago, originally as an immigration officer, and moved into intelligence and investigating serious organised crime before ending up in the world of counter-terrorism, where I stayed for a really long time. Predominantly at the Home Office. The Home Office leads for the UK government on counter-terrorism, but eventually moving over to the Department for Education to set up the first team within the DFE that focused specifically on counter-terrorism protect, prepare and security for the education sector. So that meant I supported the Department for Education to consider how it would support the sector, consider the risk from terrorism. It also meant I supported the sector directly. It also meant that I worked with key counter-terrorism partners across government, Home Office, counter-terrorism police, to develop the proposals for Martyn's Law for the education sector in collaboration with key trusted partners across the education sector feeding into it. And I also led on incident response for the Department for Education. So when there was a terrorist attack or a significant violent attack, I would lead the response supporting the sector on behalf of the Department for Education.
So there's nobody better than you to speak to about this subject.
Well, I wouldn't like to say that myself, but I have experience in quite a relatively new area for education generally.
That's lovely, thank you. So Lisa, could you possibly tell us what Counter-Terrorism Protect and Prepare means and what Martyn's Law is?
Of course. So in the most simple terms, the government's counter-terrorism strategy is known as contest, and there are 4 strands of contest. Prevent, which is preventing people from being drawn into terrorism or supporting terrorism. Pursue, which is about disrupting terrorist attacks, ideally before they happen. So that's the work of the intelligence agencies, the counter-terrorism police, but also the work that they do after an incident to ensure that the perpetrators are found and brought to justice. Protect is a 3rd strand, and that's about protecting the UK from terrorist attacks. So that's right from protecting our borders, our aviation security, through to protecting our critical national infrastructure and the places where people go on a daily basis. Prepare, the 4th strand, is about mitigating the impact of a terrorist attack were it to happen. So that's the work of our emergency services, emergency response plans, all of that. So Martyn's Law, also known as the Protect duty, but actually covers both protect and prepare strands, is legislation to ensure that all publicly accessible places, including the education sector, consider the risk from terrorism and put in place proportionate measures to ensure that the people on their sites are safe.
So when I spoke to you recently, you've left the Department for Education.
Yeah.
Any particular reason you did that without being, I suppose it might be a controversial question, but can I ask you why you left the Department for Education?
Not at all. So firstly, I think it's important to say that counter-terrorism for the Department for Education is still a really new thing. Department for Education is a social policy department. Their focus is on educating our children. It's very new, and I think there remains some nervousness, and there's a real balance to be found within government between ensuring that the sector has the right information to protect its schools and colleges and universities, but also making sure that parents particularly aren't worried about sending their children to school. So it's a really, really difficult balance to be found.
Okay.
Ultimately, I found, or I decided that I could have most impact working directly with schools rather than being within the Department for Education. And schools is where my heart lies. I've got children at primary school. I'm chair of governors at their school. I've learned more and more about the intricate workings and pressures on schools. And I felt that now was the time for me to go out and support schools directly rather than as part of the bigger machine.
I'm with you. So you're passionate in what you do.
Yeah, totally.
And you believe with your experience, you've got a lot to offer people.
Yeah, and I hope so.
Brilliant. Okay. Next question then. There's a lot of people out there, Lisa, especially in the education sector, that are worried about Martyn's Law and what it means for them. Can you give your view on that?
Yes, of course, I can. But I should caveat that with the fact that Martyn's Law is not yet law. It's still a bill, a draft bill. And although I was heavily involved in it whilst working at the Department for Education, there will have been changes from the first iteration of the bill, and there's likely to be more changes as the bill goes through Parliament. So I can give my opinion on what the bill might look like and how it looks now in draft. But obviously the caveat is that there will be changes. So under current proposals, which is what we're talking about, all schools and colleges will be required to have in place plans to mitigate the impact of a terrorist attack were an attack to happen. It's that simple. It's very much that prepare bit of the contest strategy that I talked about earlier. So that means schools will be required, again, under current proposals, to consider evacuation plans, and that's evacuation in the context of terrorism, not simply fire evacuation. So that might differ slightly. Evacuation plans, that's bringing people inside away from a threat. Lockdown plans, which is locking down a site from a threat. And then communicating, being able to communicate any of those plans across the site. There'll be an element of awareness training, testing, ensuring plans are effective. There is likely to be a regulator. Whether that regulator will come and inspect schools or not is yet to be known and understood. But that is essentially what will be expected of schools: effective emergency response plans.
Yeah, I get that. So, Lisa, what do you actually do for the sector now? I mean, I've got some idea what you do, and I think it's great, but I think the people out there should know what you do, because I know you are doing an amazing job. The response we've had back, I know you're doing a great job. So let the people know what you do now.
Thanks, Chloe. That's lovely to hear. So now I work independently with schools. So in advance of legislation, but also to ensure school communities are safeguarded, I go out to schools, I review their existing security posture. So I look at their physical security and their infrastructure, but most importantly, ahead of Martyn's Law, I review their emergency plans to ensure that they're effective. I then provide schools with recommendations in the form of a report, an action plan, and then I support schools implement any of those recommendations as required. So that, in a nutshell, is what I do.
Yeah, because I think nowadays a lot of schools, schools will say, well, we'll never get a terrorist attack at our school. But you do find, and we're finding this all the time, and you must know this, working with the Department for Education, there are so many incidents, day in, day out, kids going in with knives, teachers getting attacked, and various things like that. So it is important that there is.
And you're spot on, Gary. And essentially, and this is one of the ways that I was able to convince ministers within the Department for Education how important this work was, is that although we're talking about terrorism, and as we go through this chat today, we'll talk about terrorism more. Ultimately, when an attack happens, we don't know what that motivation is. It could be a kid in crisis that has been bullied. It could be an aggrieved parent. It could be somebody just off the street. We don't know. And it's often not, until court cases that we find out the motivation. So although we're talking about terrorism, protecting your school, college, university from terrorism, protects from a whole range of other threats. And I think that's a really crucial point.
It is. Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Lisa. So, how easy is it to get schools to buy in the concept of this? I mean, obviously, there's the terrorism element, there's the incidents that are happening day in, day out. How easy or how difficult, because we know what budgets are like at the moment, how difficult is it to get to schools to buy into this concept?
It's really tricky. We both know, we work in this field, that schools are juggling an awful lot of balls. So what you find in this across the sector is that you'll have a range. You have those schools that are really good at this, and they're normally really good at it either because of really strong leadership or because incidents have happened in the past, so they've needed to be good at it, or because they're in high-risk locations, or perhaps their student body is deemed to be high risk. So, for example, religious schools might be really, really good at this. The other end of the spectrum is schools that probably just don't really think about it. Yes, they're involved in safeguarding, but they don't necessarily think of that from a significant security threat perspective. So they might not have some of these emergency plans in place. I'd say that most schools sit somewhere in the middle. There are many schools that have lockdown plans in place, but when I go and work with them, those plans would not be effective in the event of a violent attack. And I think that's the crucial.
What we're finding as well. They don't have, they've got procedures, but they don't either practice them or they haven't got the right communication. They've got various things that they're weak on, really. That by just a few simple measures, they could make it very strong, couldn't they, really?
Yeah, and a lot of them are written with scenarios of a stray dog on the premises in mind, or something like that. We live in different times, and perhaps the policies and plans and procedures haven't caught up with the times that we live in.
Yeah, because I think with what we've come across, people say, "Oh, we've already got a lockdown procedure." Yes, they might have a procedure. From where we look at the communication, and we have people that will blow a whistle or blow a horn or ring a bell or try and text people or put something on a phone or something. You can never stop an incident. I think that's a key point, that an incident will always happen. No matter what you put there, an incident will happen. It's after that, really, I suppose.
How you respond and how, in the first seconds and minutes of an incident taking place, how you can save as many lives as possible. And that's that prepare element, which is really important.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Next question then for you here, Lisa. What do you think the biggest challenges for schools when considering counter-terrorism?
Okay, so I think, as I might have covered previously, there's generally a lack of awareness. So you don't do something if you don't realise that you need to do it. So I think, number one, schools don't necessarily know, one, that Martyn's Law is on the horizon, but also two, that the government strategy expects that they're doing this now. So I think that's really important. Lack of awareness through no fault of schools at all. Secondly, lack of concise, focused guidance. Now, in the defence of anybody that's drafted any guidance out there, it's so difficult to give prescriptive guidance on lockdown, for example, because there are principles, but the principles of lockdown in one school might be completely different than another school because of the age of the school, the infrastructure, the students at that school, and so on and so forth. So the context is really important. And obviously, no government on earth is going to write so many different guidance documents that suit everybody. So I think it's really important to say that there is a lack of succinct, direct, focused guidance for those busy people within schools that are spinning all these other plays. And these, urgent safeguarding issues that they're dealing with on a daily basis. And then link upon link upon link of you might think of this, you might think of this, is very, very difficult. So, but thirdly, a lack of counter-terrorism knowledge. Now, it's all right for me to sit here and go, oh, you ought to be doing this and you ought to be doing that. But people that work in schools are educators or they're business managers. They don't necessarily have a terrorism or counter-terrorism background. And therefore, when asked to do something, where do they start? And where do they start with, 90 pages of documents? So I think they are the key challenges for schools when they're coming to this and going, crumbs, where do I start? What do I do?
I mean, from my personal perspective on this. I've looked at a lot of the information that goes out to people in education, and there's just so much information, conflicting information, and there's pages and pages and pages and pages. Like you say, there could be a 90-page document on one thing and an 80-page document on another thing. There's just a vast amount of information. So, Lisa, perhaps a follow-up question on that is, from your experience, which part precisely tends to cause schools the most issues?
Without a doubt, Gary, it's lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
At the Department for Education, the requests that I got, the majority of requests that I got from the sector were about lockdown. Again, as I said, because it's very difficult to be prescriptive with guidance on lockdown. But now I go into schools and I'll see lockdown plans in place, but they're not effective plans that will mitigate the impact of a serious violent attack.
Yeah. So what do you think they have? When we work with schools, we do Turnley tests because we think it's important. Because what you try to do with people, from our point of view, we do evacuations. There might be an incident in the hall, there might be an incident in reception, so that the students or the pupils or they're not expecting to do the same thing every time. Do you find that's an important thing that schools should be doing as well?
It's really, really important. I would caveat that with a school should decide whether or not they choose to, for example, a primary school might be worried about drilling and testing with children there. There's debate on this, and there has been for years. I think it's for a school to understand its own community and understand whether they think, one, their children will be able to do it, and two, they can get their parents on board. So I think that's really crucial. And it depends on special educational needs, children that might have experienced trauma, all of these different things that only, head teachers and teachers, they know their schools and they know their communities. So I'd say that first. Secondly, I'd say I see lots of lockdown drills, but a drill is almost the end point when something works well. In the same way that we have fire drills. We know that a fire drill, the bell goes, you leave, you don't pick up your bags, you go and queue up where you're meant to. And they work well because they've been tested and they've worked for years. I think testing and exercising almost sits ahead of that.
Yeah.
And making sure that that the plans that you're drafting and you have in place are effective, because otherwise that drill means nothing.
No.
Because, if you don't have an alert at the start of the process, but you're still drilling in a real life scenario, those people wouldn't be going into lockdown because they don't know about it. So drills are really important, but I think testing, exercising, assuring your plans first so you can understand that your plans work, and then, if appropriate, you drill your plans to make sure people are aware and they use them.
We've had conversation with people in other sectors where we work, because we don't work just in education, and they've used things like bells, or they've tried using different sound on the fire alarm, etc. And the responses we've had back are things like, people are ignoring. They said, "Well, I'm having my lunch. It's only an alarm. It's not important," and that can be an issue with a bell or whatever. People think, "Oh, is it just a practice? Is it for real? Or I'm eating my lunch? Or I'm busy doing something on the computer." So it is important that you get the right communication when an incident is happening. Like you say, practice your drills and make sure that everybody always does them. Yeah.
Yeah, completely. And you know the difference between one alert from another.
Yeah, right. Thanks for that. Lisa, how does a school start with a lockdown policy and plan? Can you give a few key pointers to help schools that don't have a clue on lockdown, and where do they start?
Sure. Okay, so firstly, this will be very high level, so don't take this away and think you've got an effective lockdown plan in place. But for a school that firstly either wants to review their existing plan or is starting from complete scratch, I always advise my schools, my clients, to think through 3 scenarios. I find it really helpful. So 3 scenarios, which I'm going to talk you through, and then I would start with 3 key questions for each of those scenarios. Sit down, workshop it, brainstorm it, whatever language you want to use, but this is what I would do. So I'm talking about a threat in each of these scenarios, and we need to think worst case scenario. So armed threat, wanting to do harm in your school. Scenario 1, the threat is outside of the school gates. Scenario 2, the threat is on the school grounds. Scenario 3, the threat is within the school building. So 3 different potential graduated responses that you need to think through. And ask these 3 questions for each of those scenarios. So 1, how would you as a school alert your entire school community of each of those threats? Do you have the infrastructure? How would you do it, and would it be effective? Question number 2, for each of those scenarios, how would you secure 1, your site in scenario 1, 2, your building in scenario 2, 3, your rooms potentially in scenario 3? Can you lock your doors? Can you cover your windows? All of these things that you need to think through, are there safe places in that room? So that would start the conversation about where would the safest places be in that school and how you would make sure that your community is safe. Question 3, for all 3, do you currently have the infrastructure to safely communicate during that lockdown? That lockdown could be minutes, but it could be hours. The threat could change. So are you as a school able to safely communicate between your members of staff to ensure that during that lockdown, everybody's safe, and equally, they know when it's safe for the lockdown to end? So there would be the 3 key scenarios, 3 key questions, but under each of those questions, there's lots of other questions to work through. But I think that would be a really good starting point for schools that have never thought about this before, but they must think about it as not a stray dog, but somebody with a weapon that wants to cause harm.
So schools have an effective lockdown alert system. Is that enough, would you say?
So I would say it's a really positive step. Yeah. And ideally, every school, in my opinion, should have a distinct lockdown alert system. Yeah. But it needs to be underpinned by a plan, because otherwise you've got an alert that goes off and everybody runs around not knowing what to do, like headless chickens. So it's step 1, a crucial step 1, but then what happens? So yes, it's important, but the plan, the procedure, the knowledge across all staff of an effective emergency response plan, lockdown plan is also key. So 2 real key elements there.
Yeah. What we found, Lisa, and I mentioned this earlier about the different types of communications that there are in schools. A lot of people say it's not fit for purpose just having a bell or a whistle, because what does a whistle mean? What does a bell mean? Does a text message work? Does an app work? Because you'll find with everything, you'll find that the app might not be on, the phone might not be on, it might be on silent, somebody hasn't got the phone with them. It could be that, I don't know, what does a whistle do? What does a bell do? Different types of scenarios we've come across where if it's an irate parent in a reception, what you don't want to do is start ringing bells because it'll make them more irate. So you have to have different types of communications. You know, it could be that you have screen software. It could mean that you have an app. It could mean that you have a zone. Well, what we do is a zone system, so we can just let certain areas know that this is happening without the attacker or the person that's causing the incident the knowledge of it. So I think the schools you've come across, have you had any school that you have actually worked with in the past that have had, I'm going to ask you now, had a good communication system in that would do all that?
I'd say I have not worked with a school that would do all that. No. I'm going to protect my clients by giving levels of detail, but I have worked with some schools that have completely ineffective means of alerting the schools. And I think that, for budgetary reasons, and this is crucial, until there's legislation, perhaps, and a potential regulator, schools have to prioritise their budgets, and this is likely a reason why, and this is likely why they're either using the fire bell in a different way, or using a klaxon, or a handheld bell, or what have you. And all I would say is fair play to them for even thinking through a lockdown plan at that point, but it's not an effective way of communicating across a site, and I definitely haven't with any schools that are able to zone their schools in that way.
It's all about cost. So from our point of view, what we try to do with all the schools, colleges, universities, everybody we work with, we keep the cost as low as possible. We make it affordable for everybody. Some schools might, or universities might, want to do bits at a time to make things more effective than they've got at the moment. But yeah, I agree with you that budgets is always a problem. Finance is a problem in school. But then again, we did speak to a couple of police officers, and they said, "Well, what price would you put on a life?" That's
exactly.
You don't like that. It's a shocked statement to make there, but that is the case. What price would you put on a life? Lisa, what advice would you give to schools that are drilling lockdown for the first time? We've seen articles, obviously, in the press about parents worried that schools are drilling lockdown. What do you think about this?
Okay, I think, we all see articles in the press, and I can understand why parents witnessing this for the first time would be shocked. We see things like this from America, don't we? And there's a real concern that maybe either we're overreacting as a nation, or even worse, that, we might end up being like America. So I can understand generally why this subject causes concern. I think with Martyn's Law, and just more generally, there's a real step change, a need for a step change in our culture in terms of being more security conscious, more aware. We live in different times, an increase in knife crime, increase in mental health issues. There are real threats out there before we even get to talking about terrorism. But I think what schools need to do, if of course they decide that they want to drill lockdown with the children, particularly when it's young children, I think that's key. I think older children drilling lockdown is probably a good idea at secondary. These are skills, life skills that they should be thinking about. But for younger children, it's for school to make a decision based on the context of their school, the cohort of children that they have. Children that already have in place personal evacuation plans, perhaps, special educational needs, children that have previously experienced trauma, and make a decision on whether they think it's a good idea for their school. So that's point one. If indeed they think it's a good idea for their school, I would advise schools to pull together a comprehensive communication strategy, which will include how they'll bring parents, carers along with this journey. And that will involve explaining to parents and carers that this is not about a specific threat to the school. This is about a change nationally, and that we are moving towards a place where schools will be legally obliged to do this. So I think it's really important that parents, they're not exposed to this through their children coming home and saying, "Mummy, I had to hide under a table today." Actually, they know that in 2 weeks' time, the school are going to do this for the first time. And if you've got any concerns about that, please come in and let's talk about it. And also, while we're talking to you separately, we're going to be talking to the children in a really sensitive way. And after we've done the drill, we're then going to talk to the children again and get their views, and we continuously improve everything that we're doing. But our ultimate aim is to make sure that your children are safe. And I think that's the key message.
That's a great point, is that? Very good point. So finally, Lisa, if you could say one thing to schools, what would it be?
Okay. I would say, we've been talking a lot about terrorism. I would say to schools that, considering the risk from terrorism now, in advance of Martyn's Law, thinking about this stuff now will ultimately safeguard and protect your communities from a whole range of threats. Yes, Martyn's Law is about terrorism, but again, we don't necessarily understand the motivation of an attack until much later. So this is about protecting your communities. Martyn's Law will raise the bar and will help you do that. But my advice to schools is start thinking about this now. Get the help that you need and make sure that your children, your pupils, your students are safe when they're at school.
And one thing I'd like to say here, Lisa, your experience and expertise and your passion for what you do, I think is brilliant. And I think for any school who seriously does care I think they should want to speak to you, or at least get advice for your services.
Thank you. Thank you. And I have a website, and please, schools, do get in touch. Even if you've just got random questions, I'm here to help, and I want to be able to support the sector. So thank you.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Lisa. And I hope this has been a benefit to everybody out here who's going to watch it.
Lovely.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you.